Dan the Artman's Book Reviews, Episode 76, The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. This was a really fun book. I am now a fan of hard-boiled detective novels. I've been meaning to read a classic of the genre for a while. I'm glad I finally did. Other than Sherlock Holmes, I haven't read much in the form of detective fiction. The first Dresden Files book and The Case of the Singing Sword are the only other two I can think of. It was really cool to read one of the books that founded the genre. I just remembered that I also read The Cuckoo's Calling, but I was pretty bored by that book, even though I did like it. The author had a powerful command of his prose. Everything was described in beautiful elegance, but I was never bored because it was written in a way that kept me interested. Raymond Chandler was a very talented writer. I loved his style and authorial voice. It was gorgeous writing, with a really cool, swaggering attitude that was a blast to read. Right away, you can tell that the main character, Detective Philip Marlowe, has an awesome, self-assured way about him. I liked him right away. I loved that it was first-person narrative through his eyes. It was really fun following him around on his investigation. I really felt like I was tooling around with Marlowe as he searched for clues, ran into scary bad guys, and combed over crime scenes. There were some really intense scenes in this book. It was quite the page-turner when Marlowe was in mortal danger or a situation that could turn deadly at any second. I love how he keeps a cool head in the face of some pretty tough characters. He was a guy I had fun rooting for. The writing did such a great job describing everything that the whole book played out in my head like a beautifully shot film. I will definitely be reading more of Raymond Chandler's work. The man could write. Lastly, I will note that there is some pretty horrible misogyny in this book that is unsettling to read in this day and age. That said, the story was fantastic and the writing is beautiful, so I think it's worth reading even with those cringe-worthy parts. I'm so glad I picked this one up. Awesome. It's actually kind of funny that I am recording this review now. Whenever I record a review of a book that I've read, if you haven't heard in a long time ago, over the course of this podcast, I went from just kind of doing any longish review that I had. I would read my review of any book, if I liked it, if I hated it, whatever it was. But then I kind of shifted and thought, you know what, it seems like a waste of time to put out reviews of books that I didn't like. I came around to the idea of just posting book reviews in this podcast of books that I really liked. And all that to say, when I go about reading a book review, it is almost always a review that I wrote a long time ago. I like reading my reviews and then kind of chewing on what I feel about the book as a whole as I look back on it, sometimes years later. All that to say, it is kind of funny that I chose to review this book, or that it was next on my list to review, from a review that I wrote a long time ago, because I just started reading the Dresden Files, or I should say rereading. I read the first two books, the first one I read in 2015, and the second in 2018, I believe. So, anyways, 5 to 10 years ago, I read the first two Dresden books, and I actually really liked them, and I'm not sure why I stopped. But all that to say, something popped into my head. One of the big gripes that people have about the Dresden Files, even though most people love them like I do, is that they are written in first person. Now I'm seeing that maybe the author of the Dresden Files, Jim Butcher, kind of caught that vibe from some of the founding books in the pulpy detective novel kind of format, even though his has an amazing twist where his detective is a wizard. I don't have much more to say about The Big Sleep, other than I wasn't really sure what to expect, and I ended up liking it quite a bit. And since these reviews are so short, I kind of like to fill out the end with a little bit of talk about books, sometimes a little about my own writing journey and my books, but this is just a funny thing that I've noticed with creatives in general, writers, musicians. A lot of times when you hear about a piece of music or a musician that one of your favorite bands or musicians was heavily influenced by, or the books that one of your favorite authors was heavily influenced by, you go back and read them, and honestly, they're usually pretty disappointing. I think a lot of that has to do with just the completely different sensibilities people have now as music listeners and readers, but it's just interesting. Going back to read this book, I actually liked it quite a bit, even though parts of it were cringeworthy. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever been really curious about who your favorite author was inspired by, only to go back and check out some of the books by those authors, just to be disappointed or to not see it the way they saw it? Another funny thing, as I've aged, and as I record this I'm 41 years old, I've come to appreciate some things I could not stand at an earlier age. For example, The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is one of my favorite books of all time, but when I went to read The Lord of the Rings, I had to stop because the movies were coming out. That's why I started reading The Lord of the Rings, so I waited until all the movies came out, and then I went back and read The Lord of the Rings. And I really liked it, and it was a very rewarding read by the time I got to the end of The Return of the King. However, it kind of felt like a bit of a slog. When I read The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, a science fiction classic, it also was kind of a slog until I read it with a different sensibility, remembering that it was written quite a long time ago, just like The Lord of the Rings, where not every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. It's not all about driving the action forward, but sometimes just developing the story world and a lot of things that even now a lot of epic fantasy novels will do. All that to say, after finishing The Lord of the Rings, I tried to read The Silmarillion. And I couldn't. It was just too much. Maybe the right word is too dry. Like a lot of The Lord of the Rings had been. It was the same with Dune. I just saw Dune Part 2 in the movie theaters. And before Dune Part 1 came out, the new version of Dune in the movies, I reread Dune and I loved every minute of it. But the first 4 times I read it, I could not get into the book and I put it down. It was only because my good friend from the Art Institute of Seattle, where we both went to art school, was reading through them or had just finished the series and gave them high praise. So I believe it was actually the 4th time I tried Dune, and I got to the scene where finally some action happens. And then from that point on, I was hooked and I liked the rest of the book. But then the second time I went to read it, I enjoyed every page, or as listening to it, every minute of the audiobook. In the same way, I found this amazing podcast called the Prancing Pony Podcast, where they go through the Legendarium, which is just all of the books in the Lord of the Rings universe. And for every chapter of a book that you read, they have like at least an hour-and-a-half long episode discussing that chapter. In this way, I was able to make my way through the Silmarillion successfully by listening to one chapter of the Silmarillion audiobook and then listening to an episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Then I went through The Hobbit and the episodes of that podcast, and it was an amazing experience, also because there are new versions of the Lord of the Rings audiobooks narrated by Andy Serkis. And they're amazing not just because he can do the voice of Gollum like no one else because he voiced Gollum in the movies, but because he is a tremendous audiobook narrator and actor, and even his narration voice is phenomenal, and he really brings those books to life. If you haven't checked out The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, narrated by Andy Serkis, you really have to check that out. Okay. I've been cooped up a lot because I've been fairly sick for a while, so I'm rambling, but the format of this podcast has changed a little bit in the way that I used to read the review, give you a little spiel about Audible, which I no longer am sponsored by. Never really worked for me, which is fine. I still love Audible and use Audible all the time and have gotten all of my kids into audiobooks now. But maybe this will be something that some of the listeners of this podcast will enjoy. Just a little bit more banter about books and reading in general and creativity. If you didn't know, I am actually a fiction author as well. I have a few books out. One is a novel called Haunted House Flipper, about a realtor who discovers magical tools he can use to rid a property of evil spirits. And I also have a really fun chapter book that you can read to your kids called The Case of the Missing Snowman, along with a few novellas and over 20 short stories, all available wherever fine ebooks are sold and paperbacks for my longer stories. Links of which you can find at my website, dandantheartman.com. Lastly, if you haven't been listening, when I get to episode 100, I'm going to change this into a kind of book club experience where I read through 100 books to read before you die, read my reviews of the books, but also answer 12 questions I found of how to run a good book club all about the books. So in that way, I'm just kind of adding a little more chatty bits to the end part of this podcast so that it's not solely me reading the review, which is fine too. I happen to like short podcasts as well. Well, that's all I've got for you this time around. Until next time, happy reading.
This podcast is brought to you by dandantheartman.com, where you can find more book reviews, entries on Dan's writing journey, and links to purchase Dan's books, like Haunted House Flipper or The Case of the Missing Snowman. Music by Dan Absalonson.